Thank you for joining us this evening. Good to have all of you here. We continue our study in the book of Micah. We have covered the first 5.5 chapters. We're pretty much through chapter 6. I hope we'll finish it this evening. So I hope you open your Bible to Micah chapter 6. We'll be beginning in verse 9 in just a moment. We pointed out how that one of the unusual or special aspects of this one of the minor prophets is that God is putting the people of Judah and Israel, but mainly Judah, on trial, as though he is testifying against them in a courtroom. Okay, and so the first couple of chapters is God's testimony against them and their sins and the punishment that will come as a result. Chapters 3 through 5, he specifically talks about the rebukes of the leaders, but he also talks about the blessings that would come through a leader to come in the future, which of course was Christ. Now, as the last couple of chapters, God is basically saying to them, okay, you testify what you have against me, and I'll testify what I have against you. And so he gives them the opportunity to tell what he's done, if they can find anything. Of course, they can't find anything that he's done wrong in the first few verses. And then he's then telling them the things that they've done wrong. So that's what we have in these verses. The first 5 verses talk about the good things God did for them, how he blessed for them and brought them out of Egypt and protected them from enemies that would try to bring harm to them and so on. And then in the next section, which we ended last time, and especially in verse 8, he talked about what he expected of them, what he required of them that they were not doing. That in fact they were apparently thinking that if they would go through the motions of worship, that God would accept them even though they weren't obeying him. But he said what was required of them was that they do justly and love mercy and walk humbly before God. So that's where we were at the end of class last time. Questions or discussion anybody has through verse 8 before we continue this evening? Okay, let's go ahead and read some more of it then. Let's read verses 9 through 12. Who would like to read for us, please? Chapter 6 of Micah, verses 9 through 12. Bill, please.
The Lord's voice cries to the city, wisdom shall see your name. Hear the rod who has appointed it. Are there yet the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the short measures, that is the abomination? Shall I count pure those with the wicked scales, and with the bag of deceitful weights? For her rich men are full of violence, her inhabitants have spoken lies, and their tongues is deceitful in their mouth.
Okay, so having said what he expects them to do, he contrasts that in these verses with what they're really doing. The way they're conducting themselves compared to what he just got through saying that they should have been doing. And the Lord, his voice cries and so forth in verse 9, and says that they should hear the rod and who appointed it. So what is wisdom? What is a wise person? Question number 15 in our questions. What's a wise person going to understand then, verse 9? What is he supposed to understand if he's truly a wise person? Verse 9. Velma.
Well, the Lord's going to use a rod of correction, and it's warning them about this, and he wants them to know who it is that's calling out to them. He wants them to recognize him.
Okay. A wise person will learn the things that we've just been studying, that here's the way God wants you to live, justice and mercy and humility and so on. A wise person will learn that and recognize the coming of the rod if they don't. In other words, there's going to be punishment if people don't do the kinds of things that God has just said that they should. So a wise person will understand that. Okay? Other comments or discussion on verse 9. I don't know about you, but the New King James says, hear the rod. That kind of threw me for a little bit. Did someone have a different translation other than hear the rod? If you look at Susie?
Heed.
Heed the rod. And that's the basic idea. Doesn't mean physically you're going to hear a rod, but pay attention. A rod is coming, and God is the one who has appointed it, so it's going to come if you don't pay attention to it. So you learn the lesson, just like a child. When he recognizes, I remember when my mom went for the rod, I knew that meant pay attention. Okay, and that's the point here. Okay, other comments on verse 9. All right, so they were supposed to pay attention. If they were wise, they would. But what problem does God see? What concerns him in verse 10? Question number 16. He's told them what they should do, but what's the problem in verse 10, Steve?
They're dealing unjustly.
All right. So you have a form of injustice. Okay, and more specifically, what does it say that they've done? Karen.
Their treasures were gotten through wicked means.
Okay. So, whereas God had told them what they should do, in fact, there are treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked. Okay, and the short measure that is an abomination that leads into verse 11, we'll talk more about that. But there's treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked. What does that tell you about the wicked? Well, they're still doing wickedness, right? Steve?
They had wealth and power, and they abused it.
Okay. And so, rather than eliminating from their lives and even from their possessions wickedness and the fruits of wickedness, they still had them. There's still the evidence of the wrongdoing in their lives, their houses, and so on. And of course, it's a question, but the answer is obvious, that they aren't heeding the rod. They aren't living the kind of conduct that he just got through telling them they need to. Okay? Other comments on the first part of verse 11, the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked. Under the last part of the verse, then, the short measure, that is an abomination, is still part of the question. And it goes into verse 11, then, shall I count pure those with the wicked scales and the bag of deceitful weights? Okay. So what's the significance of the bag of wicked scales, with the wicked scales and the bag of deceitful weights? We're question number 17 now. What problem is he describing here, Rick?
To me, this is just like what we consider a used car salesman today, that would lie to you and make you think you're buying something great when they know it's going to break down a week later.
Okay.
They're doing the same thing here. They're saying, okay, you're bringing me 100 pounds a week, but my scale says it's only 80 pounds. So they didn't have much but to accept what these people give them.
All right, so we've discussed this problem elsewhere in the Minor Prophets. So question number 18, what are some other passages that talk about unfair weights and balances? What else have we talked about this or other scriptures, Steve?
In Deuteronomy 25, 14 and 15, it says, you shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure, that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord your God is giving you.
Okay, so you shouldn't have two sets of scales. You shouldn't have one scale that when you're weighing what somebody gives to you, you pay them for a certain amount, like Rick was saying, when in fact your scales gave you more than what you paid for. But if he's buying from you, then your scales gave him less than what he paid for. Okay, it's a large scale and a small scale. Now, that was specifically the problem there, but Steve has brought up other examples. It's the idea of it just, in fact, business dishonesty. But when in fact, cheating people in business is what's being discussed here. Other comments or other scriptures or comments on the idea of the wicked scales and the bag of deceitful weights. Rick.
Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 23 says, diverse weights are an abomination to the Lord.
an abomination to the Lord to have diverse weights. Bill?
Hosea 12, verse 7. The cunning Canaanite, deceitful scales are in his hand. He loves to oppress.
All right, so we've already studied it in the book of Hosea, haven't we? We've been over this already before. Did I see other hands? Karen.
Well, I had the same scripture, Rick had, but I just wanted to comment. This particular thing would be a much bigger problem on a larger scale in those days, because so much of what they raised and then their profit was made through selling to buyers who would weigh it. Today, most things we buy are already weighed out for us, but in those days, the vast majority of their profit was made through weighing what their produce was.
Okay. Other comments? Rick?
Well, I think it all goes back to verse number 8. When he tells you there, oh man, what is good? And God tells you what the three things are that he says is good. These are completely opposite.
All right, so what we've got is applications of verse 8, don't we? God requires justice. What is it? Just to cheat people in business and tell them that you're giving them a certain amount for what they've paid when in fact you're not giving them that amount? Is that just? And so forth? Is it merciful? Is it even humble? Proper appreciation of other people and their importance. Is that? So it's none of those things, is it? When you cheat people, someone in business. Okay? Other comments on verse 11? Okay, just go back to Karen's comment. The truth, though, Karen, that everything that we buy is measured at some point. It may not be measured when you buy it, but it's measured at some point. And that's one reason why our government regulates many of those kinds of things. If you buy a gallon of gasoline, you trust the government has checked, and you look on the tank, the pump at this gas station, you see it's checked every so often to make sure it's given the right amount. If that wasn't being done, there's lots of ways that people could cheat us today. If you bought a pound of meat in the grocery store, well, is it really a pound? Well, you trust it that it is. So it's still a problem. It's just that we trust that the government is checking on those things to make sure it's done right in our society. Okay, other comments? Okay, so here's the problem, that people are, there's treasures of wickedness in their homes, and there's wicked scales. How about verse 12? What other problem is there in verse 12? There's another problem that he's concerned about. And what's that? Susie, was your hand up?
The rich are full of violence. All the inhabitants speak lies, and their tongues or speech is full of deceit.
Okay, I see some other hands. All right, so here we have another problem. Rich men are full of violence. Inhabitants have spoken lies, their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. So you have a problem of violence, lies, and deceit. Okay? So I ask you then question number 20, and we've discussed this to some extent already. How does this harmonize with verse 8? If people act with violence, lies, and deceit, how does that harmonize with what God required according to verse 8? Okay. Frank?
God has told us what he expects of us, what he desires of us to be and to do, and he doesn't tolerate or accept wickedness.
Okay. So specifically, violence, well, how does that, is that justice? Is that mercy? Is that being humble? If you're guilty of violence? We see it all, hear it frequently around us. Is our society practicing justice and mercy and humility? people telling lies, people deceiving others with their mouths. Well, we hear and observe that frequently, don't we? Do we have justice and mercy and humility in our land when those things happen in our land? Okay. So what he's doing then is he's showing that, in fact, they have not practiced the things that he expects of them. So back to the first part of the chapter then, the point is, what good does it do for you to go through the motion of making all of these sacrifices if you're not going to change, if you're not going to correct your life, if you're not going to do the things that I expect of you in proper conduct and treating other people? Okay, other comments through verse 12. Who is it that's specifically he's talking about in verse 12 that's guilty? Rick.
Right back in verse 10 it says, in the house of the wicked.
All right, it's the house of the wicked. And specifically in verse 12, it's those who are rich. Okay, now not all rich people are this way. I doubt if they were all that way even in that day. But it's common among those who are rich that they got their wealth by this kind of deceit and lying and so forth. Okay. Anything else through verse 12? Now let's read the rest of the chapter then. Let's read 13 through the end of the chapter, 13 through 16. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Verse 13 through 16. Steve, please.
Therefore I will also make you sick by striking you, by making you desolate because of your sins. You shall eat, but not be satisfied. Hunger shall be in your midst. You may carry some away, but you shall not save them. And what you do rescue, I will give over to the sword. You shall sow, but not reap. You shall tread the olives, and not anoint yourselves with oil, and make sweet wine, but not drink wine. For the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of Ahab's house are done. And you walk in their counsels, that I may make you a desolation, and your inhabitants a hissing. Therefore you shall bear the reproach of my people.
Okay. So now he discusses the consequences, beginning in verse 13. So he's told them, he's making his accusations against them, the first part of the verse. Going through the motions of sacrifice isn't the solution to their problem because they're not living according to the things he requires of them. So, what's he going to do? Verse 13. What consequence is going to come? Bill.
You will be made sick by being struck.
All right. Sickness by being stricken and being made desolate. Okay. Comments? Okay, and I don't know that he's literally talking about the sickness, although it could be. It certainly has been at times, hasn't it? We've seen that in other of the Old Testament books, that he struck people with sickness. He certainly did it, for example, to the people of Egypt with the plagues and so on. So it could be that, or it could just be a general expression for the problems, the desolation that he's going to bring upon them. Why? What's the cause of these things happening? Terry.
The sins that he's just enumerated.
All right, this is the consequences. The problems that he just described, that's the sins. Now here's the consequences. Okay? Other comments on verse 13? Terry.
The ESV in verse 13 says, therefore I will strike you with a grievous blow.
Okay, a grievous blow rather than sickness. Okay. All right. Other comments? All right, verse continues then in verse 14, and he gives some specifics. And again, we'll look at them and then maybe comment on them. What are some specifics, he says, and I list them for you on question number 22. So he says, you're going to do this, but here's what's going to happen. All right, so let's look at them, verse 14. It says, you shall eat, but what would happen when they ate? What happened when they ate? Verse 14. Say it again.
They won't be full.
They won't be full. They won't be satisfied. Eating, you won't have enough to satisfy, or you won't find it satisfying. And then he says, so hunger will still be in your midst. You'll still be hungry even though you've eaten. And they'll try to carry some away. But what happens there? They try to carry some away, but what happens then? Bill?
It won't save them.
All right, they won't save it. Okay? What do you suppose that means? You carry some away, but you won't save it. What's his meaning there, Frank?
They won't be able to preserve it because it will be taken away from them.
Okay. So how do you try to save some? Maybe save some for later. Try to have something to put aside, but you won't be able to save it. So you try to carry it away, but you won't be able to save it. And if they do rescue it, what will happen to it? That's part of verse 14. If they do rescue it, what's then? Susie?
Be taken away, I assume, by violence, by the sword.
Okay. By some other means, it would be removed. Okay? Okay. All right, so then he continues. It's verse 15, they sow, but what happens?
Won't reap.
They don't reap. You're not going to benefit from the crop. Okay? You're not, for whatever the reason, you're not going to have a crop, you're not going to benefit from it. What happens with the olives? They tread the olives, and what then? Verse 15. Frank?
They tread out the olives, but they won't be able to anoint themselves. They won't be able to use the oil from the olives.
Okay, so they won't benefit from the olives, even though they try to have a crop, they try to tread it out, they won't benefit from it. And the same thing then for the wine. You make wine, but you won't drink it. Okay? All right, so what's the point of all these examples? All the specific examples, but what's the point of all of them? Basically, there's one thing they have in common. What's that, Terry?
That what they have taken unjustly, they're not even going to be able to get now.
Okay.
The things that they have taken from others, the prosperity that they have had, is not going to continue.
Okay, so even though they are grasping for these various things in the ways that they've been trying, it's a violation of God's teaching. It's not just, it's not merciful, it's not humble. You're going to be punished for it. You're not going to benefit from it. Now, it may be the very specifics, but it's not just these specifics. It's the general principle that God is saying you're not going to benefit from. You think you're doing these things for your own benefit. You're going to prosper. You're going to get away with it, but you're not going to. And ultimately, of course, he knows they're going to go into captivity, as we've seen. Okay? Other comments? Through verse 15. Okay, so the problem that they've got is they desire to eat, but they're not going to be satisfied. They desire to keep some for themselves, but they won't be able to. The enemies will take it. You want to sow, tread olives, tread grapes, but there'll be no harvest, no oil, no wine. Okay? Right.
All that going back to what he said in verse 13, that they'll be made desolate.
Right. These are specifics, but the general outcome is desolation, loss of well-being, and of the things that you would like to have. Other comments through verse 15. Susie.
God had told them in the very beginning that this is what would happen in Deuteronomy 28. In the first 14 verses, he tells them the blessings, the extreme blessings that they'll receive if they're obedient. But then in verse 15 on, he's very explicit about how he's going to punish them for their disobedience.
So this isn't anything new, is it? God has been saying this ever since he first brought them out of Egypt. He's told them repeatedly, if you don't do what I tell you to do, then I'm not going to be able to bless you. I'm not going to bless you. But if you do what I tell you to do, you'll be blessed. I'll bring you into the land of Canaan. You'll get the property, the land, the cities, and so forth, the vineyards and so on that belonged to the people that were there. I want to cast them out of the land. I'm going to put you in. But if you live like they did, the same thing will happen to you. I'll cast you out too. You won't prosper if you don't obey me. Okay? Other comments? That's Terry.
The idea that how we treat our fellow man is how we're treating God is evident in these, because he's talking to them about the things they're doing to their fellow man. But he says, if you're, like he says in verse 9, if you're wise, you will hear and fear my name. You'll fear my name. But when we don't treat our fellow man right, we don't fear the name of God, because he's the one we're actually acting against.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, we have one more verse in chapter 6. Question number 24. Who did the people follow? They're not following God. They're not doing what he told them to do. So who does he say they are following in verse 16? Brian.
Omri and Ahab.
Omri and Ahab. Okay. Well, in order to understand that, we have to know some of our history of the Old Testament, don't we? Who are Omri, who are Ahab? And what does it have to do with the point here? Omri, Ahab, Steve.
They were a couple of Israel's most wicked kings.
Okay, very wicked kings. I see a couple other hands. Rick.
Omri, back in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 25. So verse 23, first Omri became king over Israel. And then in verse 25, Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all who were before him. For he walked in all the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat in his sin, by which he had made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols.
Okay, so it says an interesting thing. It said about Omri, he'd been more wicked than any of the kings before him. How did Omri come to power? Killed the previous king, right? That's how he came to power in the first place. Okay, what was the relationship? How about Ahab? Mentions Ahab. What's Ahab's relationship to Omri? It's his son. What does it say about Ahab? What kind of king was he?
He had done more wickedly than all before him.
And then more wicked than all before him. Okay, what were you going to say, Karen?
See,
Okay. And who was his wife? Jezebel. That tells you a lot right there, doesn't it? And we remember the story is that involving him and taking Naboth's vineyard and so forth. But specifically, what specific evil was Ahab known for? Maybe that's a little bit too specific a question, but do you remember what specifically he was known for because of Jezebel? Susan?
Well, killing the prophets.
Oh, kill the prophets. Okay. He also introduced Baal worship. Okay, in a minute, notice it said Omri brought the people continued with the sins that were introduced by Jeroboam. But that didn't involve Baal worship. They still claimed they were worshiping Jehovah, but they used idols and so on. It was false worship, but it was Jezebel's influence through Ahab that brought Baal worship. And so he says, back now to Micah 6, the statutes of Omri are kept, the works of Ahab's house are done, and you walk into their counsels. Not what God says, but what these false, wicked kings say. Okay? Other comments? Frank?
Also in 1 Kings 16, a comment was made that all that they did provoked God. Their evil was provoking to God.
Okay, which goes back to Terry's point that God is when you do wrong to other people, you're not just doing wrong to other people. And that's an important point. You're doing wrong to God because God is the one who created those people. They're in his image, and he expects us to treat them right. Last part of verse 16, what's the consequence then? If they're going to walk after the counsels of Omri and Ahab, what's the consequence? Last part of the verse. Susie.
Do you want the first part or the whole part?
the whole last part. What she says is going to have to do with the last part of the
Well,
verse.
he's going to bring them to ruin or desolation. Their inhabitants will be a hissing or an object of derision, and they will bear the reproach of the people by going into captivity.
Okay, so there'll be a desolation, a hissing, reproach, a mockery. People will know that they didn't obey their God, and that's why this happened. Okay, other comments through verse, well, in the chapter. Anything else in the chapter 6 before we leave it? Anybody? Okay, so God has made his accusations, as in his testimony as a witness. He's made his accusations. He called upon them to testify against him. Of course, there wasn't anything they could complain about him. He's pointed out now that I expect certain things of you. You didn't do it. In fact, you did the opposite. So don't think that going through the motions of offering sacrifice is going to solve the problem. You're going to go into captivity. Your land's going to be desolate because you haven't been doing what I told you to do. That's the sentence at the end of the trial. Okay? All right, chapter 7. As we go into chapter 7 then, he continues, but beginning, Micah says, woe is me. I'm not sure whether he's speaking just for himself now. It seems to me like he's speaking more than just for himself, but let's read some of it. Let's read let's read the first 4 verses if we get that far. I don't know. Who'd like to read chapter 7 verses 1 through 4 for us, please? Danny, please. Chapter 7 verses 1 through 4.
Woe is me, for I am like the fruit pickers, like the grape gatherers. There is not a cluster of grapes to eat, or a first ripe fig which I crave. The godly person has perished from the land, and there is no upright person among men. All of them lie in wait for bloodshed. Each of them hunts the other with a net. Concerning evil, both hands do it well. The prince asks also the judge for a bribe, and a great man speaks the desire of his soul. So they weave it together. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright like a thorn hedge. The day when you post your watchmen, your punishment will come, then their confusion will occur.
All right, so verse 1, question number 1. What illustration does the prophet use to describe himself? He says, woe is me, he's like what? Verse 1. Terry.
Like someone going to harvest a crop and there's no crop there.
Okay, looking for a crop, summer fruits, or glean the vintage of grapes. There's nothing, no cluster, no first ripe fruit. And he explains it in verse 2. Okay, a discussion on verse 1 before we look at verse 2. And what's his explanation of it in verse 2? What's he mean by that illustration? There's a man, farmer, whatever, goes out to look for the crop. There isn't any crop. There's nothing there. What's the point of the illustration, verse 2?
He's searching for good people.
I'm looking for good people. And they're not there. The faithful man has perished. No one upright among the men. They all lie wait for blood. Every man hunts his brother with a net, and we'll continue on in the following verses, which continues the point of chapter 6 then. They're not doing what he said. They're not the kind of people he told them to be. In fact, it's difficult to find anybody who is that kind of person. Okay? So, that's question number 4. What are some other passages that tell us that's the kind of people that were commonly in that day, even among those that were supposed to be God's people? What are some passages that confirm these kinds of evils among the people. Question number 4. Rick.
Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 through 28, tells you the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the search for good people there.
All right, so if you go back to the illustration of Sodom and Gomorrah, or even further back behind that to the flood, there were times when there was a lot of wickedness, a lot of evil people, and God punished the people for it. Okay? Other passages about the sin here, Bill?
Isaiah 57, verse 1. The righteous perishes and no man takes it to heart. Merciful men are taken away, while no one considers that the righteous is taken away from evil.
All right, so Isaiah makes the same teaching application, doesn't he? Wicked people, not good people, so there's going to be punishment. That's Isaiah's message, and now it's Micah's message, and the same message from almost all of the Old Testament prophets. Other passages. Terry.
Hosea 9:10 says, like grapes in the wilderness I found Israel, like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season I saw your fathers. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved.
Okay, so Hosea said it. Steve, what verse did you have?
Psalms 12 and 1. Help, Lord, for the godly man ceases, for the faithful disappear from among the sons of men.
Okay, so it's over and over again. In fact, it wasn't long ago in the Sunday morning adult class, we studied Romans chapter 3. There's that whole series of verses there where Paul's talking about the sins of the people, but every one of them is a quotation from the Old Testament. So the Old Testament repeatedly says what Micah is saying here, that the righteous people are not there. And it's so when the illustration, the farmer goes out to gather in the crop, there is no crop. It's either spoiled or it just didn't grow or whatever, but it's not there. God expected a crop of righteousness, of good people. But it's not there, it's not that way. Okay, other comments on the first couple of verses, chapter 7. All right, now notice the last part of the verse, though. He gives some specifics that go on into the next part of the next few verses. Specifically, what were they like? Okay, they weren't upright. They weren't faithful. What were they like? Last part of verse 2. What did they do? Susie.
While they were guilty of bribery, it says the powerful man, I forget the exact expression, but anyway, he utters his thoughts and made me think of, he makes known his evil intents. The people sometimes who are proud think that they're above the law and they don't mind making that known. Anyway, and then they also would scheme together to commit fraud against their brother.
Okay, so we take it, and then into verse 3 then, you've got they're lying in wait for blood, they're hunting his brother with a net. Maybe come back to that one. They do evil with both hands, the prince asks for gifts, the judge seeks a bribe, the great man utters his evil desire, and they scheme together. Okay, so they're working together to accomplish their evil. It's bad enough if a person just by himself, but here you've got people working together. Lying in wait for blood, verse 2, and hunting his brother. What's the idea of hunting your brother with a net? You got your brother with a net. What's the illustration? Terry?
He's the prey.
Oh, yeah.
Your brother is the prey.
Right, so you're like a hunter trying to catch something that you're going to kill or use for your own purposes. But it's not an animal. It's not something that for your nourishment. It's your brother. It's someone else. another human being. What's the idea of doing evil with both hands? Verse 3. Do evil with both hands means what? Okay, you're right in there with, it's not just a little bit, or accidentally every now and then. Well, you're just right in there, both digging at it as fast as you can, as hard as you can, doing evil. Evil wasn't something that just happened every now and then in these people's lives. They were active at it, diligent at it, asking for gifts and bribes and saying their evil desires and scheming together. And then verse 4, what does he compare them to? They're compared to what in verse 4?
Briar and a hedgerow of thorns.
Briar and a thorn hedge. Okay. Well, some of you, I suspect, have had briars and thorns on your property. What's it like to have briars and thorns on you, especially if it's a bunch of them, like a hedge or whatever? What are they like? Terry?
There's something you usually avoid, and they snag you, they entrap you.
Okay. They're harmful, they hurt you, they're up, they're sharp. And what good are they? Not any good.
They crowd out good.
Okay. So they're worthless, and they keep the good from being accomplished. But that's what comparing the people to. That's the way you are. You're like those briars and those thorns, rather than the good kind of just and mercy and humility that I wanted. You're hindering, killing, hurting other people. And he says, the day of your watchman and your punishment comes, and now shall be their perplexity. Maybe next time we'll take a little bit more in verse 4 and then move on through the rest of chapter 7. Questions, comments before we close? Okay, thank you.